I was drinking my morning coffee when I noticed the construction crews rolling onto what I knew was my land. And that's when I realized my quiet Tuesday in Charleston, South Carolina, was about to become anything but peaceful. My name is Derek Ingram, and I had inherited a massive piece of property from my grandfather about 3 years ago. The old man had been a farmer his whole life, owning over 200 acres just outside the city limits. When he passed, he left everything to me, his only grandson who had actually bothered to visit him regularly. The property was beautiful, rolling hills with old oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and I had been taking my time deciding what to do with it. I lived in the original farmhouse, a charming 2-story structure that my grandfather had built himself in the 1960s, and I worked remotely as a software developer, which gave me plenty of freedom. The construction noise had started about a week ago, but I had assumed it was on adjacent property. Charleston was growing rapidly, and new developments were popping up everywhere. But this morning, as I stood on my porch with my coffee, I could clearly see the equipment was well within my property line. I could see the old fence post markers my grandfather had shown me as a kid, and these people were at least 200 yards past them. I grabbed my truck keys and drove down the dirt road that wound through my property. As I got closer, I could see it was much worse than I thought. There were foundation markers everywhere, dozens of them, laid out in neat rows. Workers were operating excavators, and several concrete trucks were lined up waiting to pour. This wasn't just a couple of houses. This looked like an entire neighborhood. I parked my truck and walked up to the nearest worker, a middle-aged guy in a hard hat who was checking something on his clipboard. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Can you tell me what's being built here?" He looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "New development. Oakmont Estates. 44 single-family homes. Should be a nice community once it's finished." My stomach dropped. 44 houses, and who authorized construction on this land? He shrugged. "I just work for the construction company, buddy. You'd have to talk to the developer or the HOA. They handle all the paperwork and permits." "The HOA?" I asked, feeling my blood pressure rising. "Yeah, Oakmont Estates, HOA. They're managing the whole development. The president is usually on site in the mornings. That's her over there in the white SUV." He pointed to a large white Escalade parked near a construction trailer. I could see a blonde woman inside, talking on her phone. I thanked the worker and walked over to the vehicle. As I approached, the woman got out. She was probably in her late 40s, wearing expensive-looking athleisure wear and oversized sunglasses. Her hair was styled in that particular way that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already dismissive. "I'm Derek Ingram. I own this land, and I'd like to know why there's construction happening on my property without my permission." She actually laughed. It was a sharp, condescending sound that made my jaw clench. "Your property? I don't think so. This land was purchased by Oakmont Estates Development LLC 6 months ago. We have all the proper permits and documentation. If you own property around here, you might want to check your property lines, because you're clearly confused." "I'm not confused," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "My grandfather owned this land for over 50 years. He left it to me when he passed. I have the deed, and it clearly shows this land belongs to me." She crossed her arms, and I could see her name badge now. It read Patricia Hendricks, HOA president. Of course her name was Patricia. Of course. "Look, Mr. Ingram, I don't know what you think you own, but we've done our due diligence. We purchased this land legally. We have title, insurance, surveys, the works. You're mistaken." "Then show me your documentation," I said. "I don't have to show you anything." "You're trespassing on Oakmont Estates property. If you don't leave, I'll call the police. I pulled out my phone. That's fine. I'll call them myself. This is my land and you're building on it without permission. Her expression changed slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but she recovered quickly. You do that. But I'm telling you right now, you're wasting everyone's time. This land belongs to Oakmont Estates. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. They said they'd send an officer out to take a report. While I waited, I called my lawyer, an old friend from college named Marcus Webb, who had helped me with the inheritance paperwork. Marcus, I need you to pull every document we have on my grandfather's property. The deed, the survey, everything. Someone's building houses on my land. What, Derek, that's not possible. We filed all that paperwork correctly. I checked it myself. Well, apparently an HOA thinks they own it. Can you get down here? I'm in court this morning, but I can be there by early afternoon. Don't sign anything, and don't let them intimidate you. Too late on the intimidation part, but I won't sign anything. A Charleston Police Department cruiser arrived about 20 minutes later. The officer, a young guy named Patterson according to his name tag, took statements from both Patricia and me. I showed him my driver's license with my address at the farmhouse, which was clearly on the property. Patricia showed him some paperwork from her SUV, which looked official, but I couldn't read from where I stood. This is a civil matter, Officer Patterson said after reviewing everything. You both claim ownership of the land. That's something you'll need to resolve through the courts or with your title companies. There's no crime being committed here that I can see. They're building on my land without permission, I protested. According to her documents, she has permission from the property owner, which she claims to be Oakmont Estates. Look, Mr. Ingram, I understand you're upset, but this isn't something the police can resolve. You need to get a lawyer and sort this out legally. If you can prove ownership, you can file for an injunction to stop construction. Patricia looked smug. See, I told you that you were wrong. Officer Patterson turned to her. Madam, the same applies to you. If he can prove ownership, you'll need to cease construction. I suggest both parties work this out quickly before this becomes more expensive for everyone involved. After the officer left, Patricia walked back to her Escalade without another word. I could hear her on the phone immediately, presumably calling her lawyer. I sat in my truck and waited for Marcus, watching as the construction continued. Every minute that passed, they were doing more work on my land, and it made me furious. Marcus arrived around 2 in the afternoon, carrying a thick folder of documents. He was a tall African-American man with graying temples, always impeccably dressed. Today he wore a charcoal suit despite the South Carolina heat. Show me where the construction is happening, he said as he got out of his BMW. I walked him around the site, pointing out the old property markers I knew from childhood. Marcus pulled out the survey from his folder and compared it to what we were seeing. Derek, this is definitely your land. Every single one of these foundation markers is well within your property boundaries. The question is, how did they get permits to build here? That's what I want to know. We walked over to the construction trailer, where Patricia was sitting with 2 other people, a man in a suit and a woman with a tablet. They all looked up as we entered. This is private property, Patricia said immediately. Yes, my client's private property, Marcus responded smoothly. I'm Marcus Webb, attorney for Derek Ingram. I'd like to see your documentation showing ownership of this land. The man in the suit stood up. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive watch. I'm Richard Knowles, attorney for Oakmont Estates. We have clear title to this property. It was purchased from Harrison Development Corporation 6 months ago. Harrison Development, I said. I never sold anything to Harrison Development. Marcus was already flipping through his documents. My client's grandfather, Thomas Ingram, purchased this property in 1972. Upon his death 3 years ago, it was transferred to Derek Ingram. There has been no sale of this property to anyone. Richard pulled out his own folder. We purchased 215 acres from Harrison Development, which claimed to have acquired it through a tax sale. A tax sale? Marcus's voice sharpened. The property taxes on this land have been paid in full every year. I have the receipts right here. There was a moment of silence. Richard and Patricia exchanged glances, and I could see Patricia's confidence starting to crack. Let me see your documentation, Marcus said, extending his hand. Richard hesitated, then handed over several documents. Marcus read through them carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. This is fraudulent, Marcus said flatly. These documents claim the property went to tax sale in 2021, but as you can see here, property taxes were paid in full in 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. Someone forged these tax sale documents. That's impossible, Patricia said, but her voice had lost its edge. We did our due diligence. We paid good money for this land. Then you were defrauded, Marcus said. But that doesn't change the fact that my client owns this property, and you're currently building on it without permission. Richard was reading through Marcus's documents now, and I could see his face paling. Where did Harrison Development get these tax sale documents? That's a very good question, Marcus said, and one that should probably be answered by law enforcement, because if these documents are forged, that's fraud. The woman with the tablet, who hadn't spoken yet, suddenly said, I'll call our title insurance company. They should have caught this. Yes, you should definitely do that, Marcus agreed. In the meantime, all construction on this property needs to stop immediately. Now hold on, Patricia said, standing up. Her face was flushed red. We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into this project. We can't just stop. You're trespassing on private property and causing damage, Marcus said calmly. If you don't cease construction immediately, we'll file for an emergency injunction this afternoon, and we'll be adding the cost of repairing any damage to the land to our lawsuit. Lawsuit? Richard said weakly. Yes, lawsuit. Trespass, property damage, slander of title, and depending on what we find out about these forged documents, possibly fraud. I watched as Patricia's face went through several different shades of red and white. She grabbed her phone and walked outside, and I could hear her yelling at someone through the trailer's thin walls. Richard sat down heavily in his chair. If these documents are fraudulent, Oakmont Estates is going to lose everything. We've pre-sold 30 of the 44 homes. We've taken deposits. That's not my client's problem, Marcus said, though his tone softened slightly. But I suggest you figure out where Harrison Development got these documents, and fast. Someone committed fraud here, and you need to find out who before this gets worse. Over the next few hours, everything began to unravel. The title insurance company sent a representative who confirmed that the tax sale documents appeared to be forged. They immediately froze all funds related to the project. Patricia made dozens of phone calls, each one seeming to bring worse news. Richard called Harrison Development's office, only to discover that the company had dissolved 2 months ago, and the principals had apparently fled to Panama. By evening, the construction site was quiet. Workers had been sent home, and the equipment sat idle. Marcus had filed an emergency injunction with the court, which would be heard the next morning. Patricia sat in her Escalade, looking defeated, while Richard was still in the trailer, going through documents with the title insurance representative. I drove back to the farmhouse feeling exhausted and angry. This was supposed to be my quiet life, working from home on my beautiful inherited property. Instead, I was in the middle of a massive fraud case with 44 house foundations on my land. The next morning, I met Marcus at the Charleston County Courthouse. The hearing was in front of Judge Ellen Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for efficiency. Marcus presented our case, showing the original deed, the survey, and the property tax records. Richard presented Oakmont Estates' case, but even he seemed half-hearted about it. The forged tax sale documents were obvious once you compared them to the real property tax records. Judge Morrison didn't take long to decide. Mr. Ingram clearly owns this property. The documents presented by Oakmont Estates are fraudulent. I'm granting the injunction. All construction on the property must cease immediately, and Oakmont Estates must remove all equipment and materials within 30 days. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full investigation into these forged documents. Bailiff, please notify the Charleston County Sheriff's Office that there may be criminal fraud involved here. Patricia, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, let out a small sound that might have been a sob. Richard just nodded wearily. Outside the courthouse, Marcus put a hand on my shoulder. You won, Derek. The land is definitely yours and they can't build on it. But now I have 44 concrete foundations on my property, I said. What am I supposed to do with those? That's actually in the court order. They have to remove them as part of cleaning up the site. It's going to cost them a fortune, but that's not your problem. What about the people who put deposits on houses? The 30 families Richard mentioned, Marcus sighed. That's going to be complicated. They'll probably sue Oakmont Estates and Harrison Development. The title insurance might cover some of it. But again, that's not your responsibility. You're the victim here too. Over the next few days, the story hit the local news. Charleston HOA builds on wrong land was the headline in the Post and Courier. Reporters called me constantly, wanting interviews. I declined most of them, but the story kept growing. It turned out that Harrison Development had done this same scam in 3 other locations across South Carolina and Georgia. They would forge tax sale documents, sell the property to developers, and disappear with the money before anyone realized what had happened. The Charleston County Sheriff's Office opened a formal investigation. Detectives came to my property to document everything. They interviewed Patricia, Richard, and everyone else involved with Oakmont Estates. It became clear pretty quickly that Patricia and the HOA board were victims too, not perpetrators. They had genuinely believed they were buying legitimate property, but Patricia's problems were just beginning. The 30 families who had put deposits on homes were furious. Several of them showed up at the construction site, demanding answers. Patricia had to face them, standing in front of the construction trailer, trying to explain how they had all been defrauded. I was there that day, checking on the property when the confrontation happened. One man, probably in his 30s with a wife and 2 small children, was nearly in tears. We put down $50,000, he said. That was our life savings. We were supposed to move in next month. What are we supposed to do now? Patricia looked like she was about to cry herself. We're working with the title insurance company. They should be able to refund your deposits. Should be, a woman shouted. Should be isn't good enough. Where's our money? The funds are frozen pending the investigation, Patricia said, her voice shaking. I'm sorry, we were defrauded too. You're the HOA president, another person yelled. You're supposed to make sure this stuff doesn't happen. I almost felt bad for Patricia. Almost. She had been incredibly rude to me when I first approached her, dismissing my concerns completely. But watching her face this crowd of angry, scared people, I could see she was in over her head. She had probably thought being HOA president of a new development would be a nice prestige position, and instead, It had turned into a nightmare. The sheriff's investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, they had tracked the principals of Harrison Development to Panama City. Extradition papers were filed, though everyone said it would take months or years to actually get them back to the United States. In the meantime, they had apparently scammed developers out of over $15 million across 4 states. Marcus filed a lawsuit on my behalf against Oakmont Estates for trespass and property damage. The title insurance company immediately reached out to settle. They offered to pay for complete restoration of the property to its original condition, plus $50,000 for my trouble. Marcus negotiated it up to $75,000, and I accepted. It seemed fair, and I didn't want to spend years in litigation. The construction equipment was removed within the required 30 days. Then came the bigger job of removing the 44 concrete foundations. That took another 2 months. They had to break up all the concrete, haul it away, and then bring in topsoil to restore the land. I watched the whole process, making sure they did it right. Patricia was there most days too, supervising the cleanup. We didn't talk much at first, but eventually, during one long afternoon of watching excavators work, she approached me. "Mr. Ingram, I owe you an apology," she said. She wasn't wearing designer athleisure anymore. She looked tired, dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt. "Yes, you do," I said. "I was horrible to you that first day. You told me it was your land and I just dismissed you completely. I was so sure we had done everything right and I didn't want to hear anything different. You threatened to call the police on me for trespassing on my own property," I pointed out. She winced. "I know. I'm truly sorry. This whole thing has been a disaster. The HOA is bankrupt. We're being sued by 30 families. My reputation is destroyed. But more than that, I feel terrible about what we did to you. We dug up your land, we treated you like you were crazy, and we refused to listen when you tried to tell us the truth." I looked at her for a long moment. She did seem genuinely remorseful. "I accept your apology," I said. "But you should know, the way you treated me that first day made everything worse. If you had been willing to actually look at my documents, to have a real conversation, maybe we could have figured this out before 44 foundations got poured." "I know," she said quietly. "I've learned a very expensive lesson about assuming I'm always right and about actually listening to people." "What's going to happen to the families who lost their deposits?" I asked. "The title insurance is covering most of it." "They'll get their money back, but it's taken months and obviously they don't have the homes they were promised. Some of them had already sold their previous houses. It's a mess." She paused. "Richard, our lawyer, had a heart attack last week. The stress of everything. He's going to be okay, but he's retiring from law practice." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Whatever mistakes had been made, I didn't want people having heart attacks over it. "What are you going to do with the land now?" Patricia asked. I had been thinking about that a lot. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe keep it as is, just open space. Maybe donate some of it for a park. I definitely don't want to develop it into a neighborhood." She gave a small, sad smile. "I don't blame you." The investigation continued for months. By early summer, the FBI had gotten involved because the fraud crossed state lines. They managed to get one of the Harrison Development principals extradited from Panama, a man named Gerald Harrison who turned out to be the mastermind behind the whole operation. He had created elaborate forged documents for dozens of properties, selling them to unsuspecting developers, and making off with millions. I had to testify before a grand jury, explaining what had happened with my property. It was intimidating, sitting in that room with all those serious-faced jurors, but Marcus was with me, and it went smoothly. I just told the truth about everything that had happened. Gerald Harrison was indicted on 47 counts of fraud, forgery, and wire fraud. His trial was scheduled for the following year. The prosecutor's office told me I might have to testify again at trial, but they'd keep me informed. Meanwhile, my property was finally restored. The construction company had done a good job with the cleanup. You could barely tell that 44 foundations had been there. They had regraded everything, brought in native plants, and even replaced some of the old oak trees that had been damaged. With the $75,000 settlement, I paid off some debts and put the rest in savings. Life started to return to normal. I went back to my regular routine of working from home, taking walks around the property, and enjoying the peace and quiet. The story faded from the news cycle, replaced by other local dramas. But then, about 8 months after the initial confrontation, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. "Mr. Ingram, this is Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Chen. I wanted to let you know that Gerald Harrison has agreed to a plea deal." "What kind of plea deal?" I asked. "He's pleading guilty to all counts in exchange for a 25-year sentence. Part of the deal is that he has to provide information about where he hid the money he stole. We've already recovered about $8 million, and we believe there's more." "That's good news," I said. "It is. And I wanted to let you know that the Victims' Compensation Fund will be distributing the recovered money. Since you were a victim of property damage, you'll be receiving a payout as well." "I already settled with the title insurance company," I said. "I know, but this is separate. This is criminal restitution. You'll probably receive a check for around $30,000, maybe more depending on how much more money we recover." I was stunned. I wasn't expecting that. Mr. Harrison caused a lot of damage to a lot of people. The court wants to make sure victims are compensated as much as possible. After I hung up, I sat on my porch for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. I had gone from a quiet morning coffee to a massive fraud case, multiple lawsuits, and now criminal restitution. It had been one of the strangest years of my life. A few weeks later, I attended Gerald Harrison's sentencing hearing. I wanted to see it through to the end. The courtroom was packed with other victims, including several of the families who had lost deposits on the Oakmont Estates homes. Gerald Harrison was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He was a bland-looking man in his 50s, the kind of person you'd never notice in a crowd. But he had stolen millions of dollars and ruined dozens of lives. The judge, a stern older man named Judge Carmichael, heard statements from several victims before pronouncing sentence. One woman talked about how she and her husband had lost their retirement savings. A young couple described how they had been living in a motel with their baby for 6 months after selling their house, expecting to move into an Oakmont Estates home. When it was time for sentencing, Judge Carmichael didn't mince words. "Mr. Harrison, you have perpetrated one of the most elaborate and damaging fraud schemes this court has seen. You forged documents, impersonated officials, and sold property that you didn't own to innocent people. You stole their money, their dreams, and their security. The fact that you did this to multiple families across multiple states shows a pattern of deliberate criminal behavior. While the court recognizes your cooperation in recovering the stolen funds, that doesn't excuse what you've done. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 20 years. Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims." Harrison showed no emotion as he was led away. I felt a sense of closure watching him go. He would be in his late 70s before he got out of prison, if he lived that long. Outside the courthouse, I ran into Patricia again. She looked better than the last time I had seen her, less worn down. "Derek," she said, approaching me, I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to let you know that all the families got their money back. The title insurance and the restitution fund covered everything. That's good, I said. I'm glad they're being made whole. It doesn't undo the stress and the months of uncertainty, but at least they have their savings back. She paused. What about you? Are you doing okay? Yeah, I'm fine. The property is restored and I'm getting some additional restitution. Honestly, I'm just glad it's over. Me too. She hesitated, then said, I'm moving away from Charleston. Too many bad memories. I'm going back to Ohio, where I'm from, starting over. I hope things work out for you, I said, and I meant it. Thank you. And again, I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can enjoy your property in peace now. We shook hands and then she walked away. I watched her go, thinking about how one morning's worth of bad decisions and assumptions had spiraled into a year-long nightmare for so many people. I drove back to the farmhouse, taking the long way through Charleston, past the historic downtown and out toward the countryside. When I pulled up to my house, I sat in the truck for a moment, just looking at the property. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the grass. Everything was quiet and peaceful, exactly how it should be. Over the next few months, I decided what to do with the land. I ended up donating 50 acres to the county for a nature preserve, with the stipulation that it be named after my grandfather, Thomas Ingram. The county was thrilled. They created hiking trails and built a small pavilion for educational programs. It opened the following spring, and I attended the dedication ceremony. I kept the rest of the property for myself, including the farmhouse and about 165 acres around it. I had no plans to develop it or sell it. It was my grandfather's legacy, and I wanted to preserve it. The restitution check arrived as promised. It was for $32,000. Combined with the settlement from the title insurance company, I had over $100,000 that I never expected to have. I used some of it to renovate the farmhouse, updating the kitchen and bathrooms while keeping the historical character. I also set up a scholarship fund at the local high school in my grandfather's name for students interested in agriculture or environmental science. Life did return to normal, eventually. I continued working as a software developer, taking calls from my porch and writing code while looking out at the rolling hills. I started dating someone, a woman named Victoria Lane who worked as a park ranger at the new nature preserve. We met when she gave me a tour of the trails they had built on my grandfather's donated land. She had an infectious love for nature and conservation, and we clicked immediately. One evening, about 2 years after the whole ordeal began, Victoria and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. She knew the whole story, of course. Everyone in Charleston knew the story of the HOA that built on the wrong land. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't noticed the construction? She asked. All the time, I admitted. They would have finished all 44 houses. Families would have moved in. And then what? Eventually, the truth would have come out, probably when someone did a proper title search. But by then, there would have been a whole neighborhood on my land. The legal mess would have been unbelievable. You saved yourself and a lot of other people from an even worse situation, she said. I guess. Though I wish I had never had to deal with it at all, I still can't believe Patricia tried to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. Victoria laughed. The audacity. But at least she apologized in the end. Yeah, she did. I wonder how she's doing in Ohio. Probably staying far away from HOAs, Victoria said with a grin. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and watching the sky turn orange and purple. I thought about everything that had happened, how a simple morning coffee had led to one of the most stressful years of my life. But I had come through it. I had stood up for myself, proven my ownership, and watched as justice was served. The property was mine, secure and protected now. The Thomas Ingram Nature Preserve was educating kids about the environment. Gerald Harrison was in federal prison where he belonged. The victims had gotten their money back, and I had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of documentation and standing your ground when you know you're right. "You know what's funny?" I said to Victoria. "My grandfather always told me to keep every piece of paper related to the property. Every deed, every survey, every tax receipt. He was obsessive about it. I used to think he was being paranoid." "He was being smart," Victoria said. "Those documents saved you. They really did. If I hadn't had that deed to show, if I hadn't had Marcus and all that paperwork, I don't know what would have happened. Patricia was so sure she was right. She would have had me thrown off my own land. But you did have the paperwork and you did prove ownership. That's what matters." She was right. I reached over and took her hand, feeling grateful for everything I had. My grandfather's beautiful property, my peaceful life, and someone wonderful to share it with. The next morning, I woke up to another beautiful Charleston day. I made my coffee and walked out to the porch, just like I had done on that fateful Tuesday 2 years ago. But this time, there were no construction crews, no angry HOA presidents, no drama. Just my land, exactly as it should be. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondering if she was doing better in Ohio. I hoped she had learned from the experience, that she was treating people with more respect and actually listening when they spoke up. I thought about Richard, the lawyer, and hoped he was enjoying his retirement and recovering from his heart attack. I even thought about Gerald Harrison occasionally, sitting in his federal prison cell, paying for his crimes. But mostly, I just enjoyed my life. I worked on interesting software projects, hiked through the nature preserve with Victoria, and maintained the farmhouse that my grandfather had built with his own hands. I attended events at the local high school to meet the students who received scholarships from the fund I had created. One day, about 3 years after everything started, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Patricia. I was surprised to see it. I opened it carefully and began to read. "Dear Derek, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to reach out and let you know how things have been going since I moved back to Ohio. It's been a difficult journey, but I'm doing better. I've been seeing a therapist, working through a lot of issues about control and the need to always be right. I realize now that my behavior toward you was completely unacceptable. You told me the truth, and instead of listening, I doubled down and tried to intimidate you. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. I've also been working with a victims advocacy group here in Ohio, trying to help people who have been defrauded in real estate deals. It's my way of trying to make amends for the disaster I was part of in Charleston. I don't expect you to forgive me or even respond to this letter. I just wanted you to know that I think about what happened often, and I've tried to become a better person because of it. I hope you're enjoying your grandfather's property and that you found peace. Sincerely, Patricia Hendricks." I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in a drawer. I appreciated that she had written, that she was working on herself and trying to help others. It spoke well of her that she was taking responsibility and making changes. I did write back, actually. Just a brief note saying that I appreciated her letter, that I was doing well, and that I was glad she was finding ways to help other victims of fraud. I wished her well in Ohio and meant it sincerely. Whatever anger I had felt toward her had faded over the years. She had been wrong, absolutely, but she had also been a victim of Harrison's fraud, just in a different way. Victoria and I got engaged that fall. I proposed to her at the pavilion in the Thomas Ingram Nature Preserve, with the autumn leaves creating a canopy of red and gold above us. She said yes, of course, and we started planning a wedding for the following spring. We decided to have the ceremony on the property, under the old oak trees. It felt right to celebrate there, on the land that my grandfather had loved and that I had fought so hard to protect. We invited about 100 people, friends and family, and even Marcus, who had become a good friend beyond just being my lawyer. At the reception, Marcus gave a toast. "I've known Derek for over a decade," he said, raising his glass. "And I've never seen him as stressed as he was during the Oakmont Estates situation. But I've also never seen him as determined. He stood up for himself, he didn't back down, and he proved that documentation and truth matter. Derek, you fought for your grandfather's legacy, and you won. Thomas Ingram would be proud of you." Everyone clinked glasses and cheered. I looked around at all the people gathered on my land, celebrating with Victoria and me, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The whole HOA nightmare seemed like a distant memory now, just a strange chapter in my life that had ultimately worked out okay. Victoria and I honeymooned in Savannah, just a couple of hours down the coast. When we came back, we settled into married life at the farmhouse. She transferred to a different park ranger position closer to home, and we talked about starting a family. One afternoon, about a year after our wedding, I was working on my laptop when I got an email from the prosecutor's office. They had recovered more money from Gerald Harrison's hidden accounts, and I was receiving an additional restitution payment of $15,000. I stared at the email in disbelief. That brought the total money I had received as a result of the whole ordeal to over $120,000. It felt surreal. I had started out just trying to protect my property, and now I had received substantial compensation for the trespass and damage. I talked it over with Victoria, and we decided to use the money to expand the scholarship fund, and also to make a donation to the victims' advocacy group that Patricia was working with in Ohio. I sent Patricia an email letting her know about the donation. She wrote back immediately, thanking me and saying how much it would mean to the people they were helping. We started corresponding occasionally after that, nothing heavy, just updates on our lives. She met someone in Ohio, got remarried, and seemed genuinely happy. She never got involved with another HOA. Time passed, as it does. The Thomas Ingram Nature Preserve became a beloved community resource. Thousands of kids went through environmental education programs there. The scholarship fund helped dozens of students pursue degrees in agriculture and environmental science. The farmhouse, fully renovated but historically preserved, was featured in a magazine about Southern architecture. And through it all, I never forgot the lesson I learned that Tuesday morning when I saw construction crews on my land. Documentation matters. Standing up for yourself matters. And never, ever assume that someone who claims to be in charge actually knows what they're talking about. Always verify. Gerald Harrison served his time, or at least the beginning of it. I heard through the prosecutor's office that he had developed health problems in prison and probably wouldn't make it to his release date. I didn't feel good about that exactly, but I didn't feel bad either. He had made his choices, and he had hurt a lot of people. The families who had been defrauded all moved on with their lives. A few of them actually ended up buying houses in other developments nearby, and I'd see them occasionally at community events. They always thanked me for standing up and revealing the fraud before even more money had been invested. One couple told me that if construction had gone further, they might have lost everything, including their previous house that they hadn't sold yet. By stopping it when I did, I had minimized the damage. I had never thought of it that way, but they were right. If I had ignored the construction, or if I had let Patricia intimidate me into backing off, the situation would have been exponentially worse. 44 completed homes, multiple families moved in, and then the discovery of the fraud. It would have been catastrophic. So in a way, my grandfather's obsessive record-keeping and my willingness to stand up for myself had not only protected my property, but had also protected dozens of families from an even worse financial disaster. That felt good to realize. Victoria gave birth to our first child, a daughter we named Dahlia Rose, 5 years after the whole HOA incident. Holding her in the farmhouse that my grandfather had built, looking out at the land that he had loved and that I had protected, I felt a deep sense of continuity and purpose. This property, this legacy, would be hers someday. And I would teach her, just as my grandfather had taught me, to value the land, to keep good records, and to always stand up for what's right. One day, when Dahlia was about 2 years old, we were walking through the nature preserve. She toddled along the trail, delighted by every bird and butterfly. We stopped at a sign that explained the history of the preserve and mentioned my grandfather's donation of the land. "Grandpa," Dahlia said, pointing at the sign. She was just learning to talk, and she called my grandfather Grandpa, even though she had never met him. "That's right," I said. "This was your great-grandfather's land. He loved it very much, and now it's a place where everyone can come and enjoy nature." She didn't really understand, of course, but someday she would. Someday I'd tell her the whole story about the HOA that built houses on our land, about how I had to fight to prove ownership, about Patricia and Richard and Gerald Harrison and all of it. It would be a family story, passed down, a reminder to always protect what's yours and to never let anyone bully you into giving up what you know is right. But for now, on this sunny afternoon, watching my daughter discover the wonders of the nature preserve, everything was perfect. The nightmare was long over. Justice had been served. The land was protected and being used to educate and inspire new generations. I thought about that moment, standing on my porch with my morning coffee, when I first noticed the construction crews. I had no idea then what I was about to go through, the stress and conflict and legal battles. But I'm glad I saw them when I did. I'm glad I drove down there immediately. I'm glad I stood my ground with Patricia and didn't let her intimidate me. I'm glad I had Marcus and all my grandfather's carefully kept documents. Everything had worked out, not just okay, but better than okay. I had my property, my family, my peace, and the knowledge that I had done the right thing. The HOA's panic, when I showed them the deed, when they realized their entire development was based on forged documents, had been the beginning of the end of their nightmare and the beginning of justice being served. And now, years later, standing in the nature preserve with my daughter, I could finally say that the whole experience, as terrible as it had been at the time, had led to something good. The land was protected forever. Kids were learning about nature. Families had gotten their money back. A criminal was in prison, and I had learned valuable lessons about standing up for myself and the importance of documentation and truth. As we walked back to the farmhouse, Dahlia fell asleep in my arms. Victoria met us at the door, smiling. We went inside and I laid our daughter down for her nap. Then Victoria and I sat on the porch with glasses of sweet tea, looking out at the property that had caused so much trouble and brought so much good. "You ever wish none of it had happened?" Victoria asked. That Harrison had never forged those documents, that Oakmont Estates had never tried to build here. I thought about it for a long moment. Parts of it were awful, I admitted. The stress, the confrontation with Patricia, the months of legal battles. But if it hadn't happened, I might not have donated the land for the preserve. I might not have started the scholarship fund. I definitely wouldn't have met you since you came here to work at the preserve. So no, I don't wish it hadn't happened. I just wish it had happened differently, without so many people getting hurt. That's a good answer, she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sun move across the sky, exactly as my grandfather had probably done on this same porch for decades. The land was at peace. I was at peace. And somewhere in Ohio, hopefully Patricia was at peace too, having learned her lessons and become a better person. The HOA that had tried to build 44 houses on my land was long gone, dissolved in bankruptcy and lawsuits. But the land remained, exactly as it should be, protected and preserved for future generations. My grandfather would have been proud. And sitting there with Victoria, with our daughter sleeping inside, I felt proud too. Proud that I had stood up for what was right. Proud that I had protected the legacy I had been given, and proud of what had come from all of it. That's the thing about truth and documentation and standing your ground. It's hard in the moment. It's stressful and scary and full of conflict. But when you come out the other side, when justice is served and things are made right, it's worth it. Every difficult conversation, every court appearance, every moment of doubt and worry becomes worth it when you can look back and say, I did the right thing, and good came from it. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Victoria squeezed my hand. Inside, Dahlia stirred in her sleep. And I sat there on the porch of my grandfather's farmhouse, on land that was mine beyond any doubt, grateful for everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. The HOA was gone, the criminals were punished, the victims were compensated, and life was good. That's all anyone can really ask for.